Welcome, sailor. This is the story of a marine hull inspector who thought he was conducting a routine safety check on a cargo vessel in the South China Sea, until a catastrophic structural failure sent the ship to the bottom in less than 4 minutes, leaving him as the sole survivor among 23 crew members. What began as a standard inspection became a desperate fight for survival.
My name is James Morrison, and for 8 years I've been inspecting vessel hulls across the shipping lanes of Southeast Asia. I've crawled through cargo holds, examined weld seams, and tested hull integrity on everything from fishing boats to massive container ships. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened aboard the MV Prosperity on September 8th, when my routine inspection revealed a structural flaw that would claim 22 lives and leave me floating alone in the South China Sea. The morning started like hundreds of others in my career. The MV Prosperity was a 12-year-old cargo vessel, 180 feet long, flying a Panamanian flag and carrying electronics from Shenzhen to Manila. She'd been flagged for inspection due to recent rough weather damage, and the Port Authority in Hong Kong had contracted me to verify her seaworthiness before clearing her for departure. I'd been working as a certified marine inspector since graduating from the Glasgow School of Naval Architecture. My father had been a shipbuilder in the Clyde Yards, and I'd grown up around vessels, learning to read the subtle signs of structural stress and metal fatigue that could mean the difference between a safe voyage and a maritime disaster. The inspection contract was routine, a standard Class II safety verification that should have taken about 6 hours to complete. The vessel's owners, Chen Maritime Holdings, had a decent reputation, and Captain Chen Wei had been cooperative during our preliminary discussions. I boarded at 6:15 a.m., meeting Captain Chen Wei, a veteran mariner in his 50s who'd been running cargo routes through these waters for over 20 years. His crew of 21 men was a mix of Filipino and Chinese sailors, experienced professionals who'd worked together for several voyages. "Inspector Morrison, welcome aboard," Captain Chen said, shaking my hand firmly. "We appreciate you making this quick. We're already 12 hours behind schedule due to port delays in Shenzhen." "I'll work as efficiently as possible, Captain," I replied, adjusting my toolkit. "But safety can't be rushed. I'm sure you understand." The MV Prosperity appeared well-maintained from the outside. Her hull showed the typical wear of a working cargo vessel: rust stains, minor dents from dock contact, and the general weathering that comes from years of ocean service. Nothing immediately alarming, but I'd learned during my 8 years of inspection work to look deeper than surface appearances. The cargo manifest showed electronics and computer components, relatively light cargo that shouldn't stress the vessel's structural limits. The loading appeared properly distributed, and the crew seemed competent and professional. I began my inspection in the forward cargo hold, working systematically through the vessel's structure. My toolkit contained ultrasonic thickness gauges, crack detection equipment, stress analysis tools, and various measuring devices that could reveal problems invisible to the naked eye. The ultrasonic gauge was my primary diagnostic tool. It could measure hull plate thickness to within hundredths of a millimeter, detecting corrosion and metal fatigue that might compromise structural integrity. The crack detection equipment used magnetic particle testing to reveal stress fractures that could propagate under load. The work was methodical and precise, requiring hours of careful measurement and documentation. Each weld seam had to be examined for fatigue cracks. Every hull plate needed thickness measurements to check for corrosion. The frame structures required stress analysis to ensure they could handle the loads they were designed to bear. My inspection routine had been developed over years of experience. I worked in a specific pattern that ensured complete coverage while maximizing efficiency. Start with visual examination, then move to detailed instrumental testing, followed by stress analysis and documentation. By 9:30 a.m., I'd completed the forward sections and was moving toward the engine room. The crew went about their business around me, preparing for departure while I crawled through compartments with my instruments. The engine room inspection showed normal wear patterns and no significant structural concerns. The crew was professional and helpful, clearing access routes and providing lighting for my work. Chief Engineer Ramirez, a Filipino with 15 years' experience on cargo vessels, answered my technical questions and provided maintenance records when requested. That's when I found it. In cargo hold number 3, Positioned midships where the vessel experiences maximum stress during heavy seas, my ultrasonic gauge detected something that made my blood run cold. The hull plating showed severe thinning, from the original 15 millimeters thickness down to just 4 millimeters in several critical areas. This wasn't normal corrosion. This was catastrophic structural deterioration that should have been caught during previous inspections. The affected area covered approximately 12 square meters of hull plating, concentrated around stress points where the vessel's frame structure transmitted loads to the outer hull. Worse, my crack detection equipment revealed stress fractures radiating out from the thin sections. The cracks followed predictable patterns, starting at the thinnest points and propagating along lines of maximum stress. Some of the fractures were nearly 6 inches long, indicating that the deterioration had been progressing for months or possibly years. I took detailed photographs and measurements, documenting everything with the thoroughness that my training and professional responsibility demanded. This was exactly the kind of structural failure that had caused major maritime disasters in the past. "Captain Chen," I called over the ship's intercom. "I need you in cargo hold 3 immediately. We have a serious problem." When he arrived with Chief Engineer Ramirez, I showed them the readings on my instruments. The look on Captain Chen's face told me he understood the implications immediately. This was a vessel on the verge of catastrophic structural failure. "How serious?" he asked quietly, studying the ultrasonic readings that showed hull thickness reduced by nearly 70% in critical areas. "This vessel is not seaworthy," I told him directly. "These hull plates could fail catastrophically under normal sea conditions. We need to return to port immediately and offload the cargo for emergency repairs." Captain Chen studied my readings carefully, his expression growing more concerned as he understood the technical implications. I could see him calculating the cost of delays, the pressure from shipping schedules, the economic impact of my findings. "Are you certain? These readings could be anomalous. Perhaps the equipment needs recalibration." "Captain, I've been doing this for 8 years," I replied firmly. "This hull is structurally compromised. One good swell could punch a hole right through these plates. This isn't a matter of interpretation, this is physics." I showed him the stress analysis calculations, explaining how the reduced hull thickness created dangerous concentration points where normal ocean loads could exceed the material's failure limits. The mathematics were unforgiving. This vessel could not safely operate in open ocean conditions. Chief Engineer Ramirez examined my crack detection results, his face pale as he recognized the severity of the situation. "Captain, if these measurements are accurate, we should have detected this during our last dry dock inspection." "When was your last complete hull survey?" I asked. 18 months ago, Captain Chen replied. "But we've had regular inspections since then. That was part of the problem. Routine inspections often focused on obvious problems while missing progressive deterioration that developed slowly over time. The corrosion and stress fractures I detected required specialized equipment and systematic testing to identify." At 10:45 a.m., Captain Chen made the decision to turn back toward Hong Kong. The crew began securing cargo and preparing for the course change, though most of them weren't told about the specific nature of the structural problems I'd identified. I continued my inspection, documenting everything I'd found for my report. The hull deterioration was localized but severe, concentrated in areas where the vessel's design created natural stress concentration points. This wasn't random corrosion, it was predictable failure following well-understood engineering principles. The weather forecast called for moderate seas with swells up to 8 feet, conditions that a properly maintained vessel should handle without difficulty. But for the MV Prosperity, even moderate conditions could be enough to trigger catastrophic hull failure. But the South China Sea had other plans. At 11:23 a.m., we encountered a weather front that the meteorologists had missed or underestimated. It wasn't a storm, just a series of larger swells from a distant typhoon, the kind of sea conditions that commercial vessels encounter routinely throughout the shipping season. I was in the engine room documenting my findings when I heard the sound that would haunt me forever, a deep, metallic groaning that seemed to come from the ship's very bones. It was the sound of stressed metal reaching its breaking point, exactly what my calculations had predicted would happen under increased loading. The sound was unmistakable to anyone with experience in marine engineering. It was the sound of hull plates deflecting beyond their elastic limits, of stress concentrations approaching failure loads, of a ship beginning to break apart under forces it was no longer capable of resisting. All hands, Captain Chen's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with controlled panic. Emergency stations. We have a hull breach in cargo hold 3. I ran toward the hold I'd been inspecting just hours earlier, but water was already flooding the corridors. The hull had failed exactly where my instruments had detected the worst deterioration. A section of plating about 8 feet long had simply given way under the stress of a normal ocean swell. The failure was catastrophic and immediate. The compromised hull plates, weakened by years of corrosion and stress cycling, had reached their breaking point when the vessel encountered swells that exceeded the reduced structural capacity. Water was coming in faster than the pumps could handle. The MV Prosperity's pumping systems were designed for normal bilge water and minor leakage, not for the massive inflow created by a hull breach of this magnitude. In less than 2 minutes, the vessel had developed a severe list to starboard as thousands of gallons of seawater flooded the cargo hold. Emergency alarms were blaring throughout the ship, and I could hear crew members shouting in multiple languages, Mandarin, Tagalog, and English mixing in the chaos of emergency response. I made it to the main deck just as Captain Chen was ordering the lifeboats deployed. The vessel's stability was deteriorating rapidly as water continued pouring through the hull breach. The list was increasing, making it difficult to walk on deck and nearly impossible to launch boats from the lower side. But everything was happening too fast. The MV Prosperity was rolling over onto her side faster than anyone had anticipated. The lifeboats on the port side were already underwater, and the crew members trying to launch the remaining starboard boat were fighting gravity and rushing water. "Morrison!" Captain Chen shouted over the chaos, pointing toward the starboard lifeboat. "Get to the boat!" I ran toward the remaining lifeboat, but the deck was angled at nearly 45 degrees and getting steeper by the second. Equipment was sliding across the deck, creating additional hazards for anyone trying to reach safety. The crew members working to launch the boat were having to hold on with one hand while operating the release mechanisms with the other. The mathematics of ship stability are unforgiving. Once a vessel begins listing beyond a certain point, the physics of buoyancy and center of gravity create a spiral that can't be stopped. The MV Prosperity had passed that point and was continuing to roll over despite the crew's emergency efforts. At 11:26 a.m., exactly 3 minutes after the hull breach, the MV Prosperity rolled completely over. I found myself in the water, gasping for air and fighting to stay afloat in the chaos of debris and rushing water. The ship's superstructure was disappearing beneath the surface, taking with it anyone who hadn't made it off in time. The transition from being on a ship to being in the water was shockingly abrupt. One moment I was running across a sloping deck, and the next I was underwater, disoriented and struggling to reach the surface while debris rained down around me. When I finally surfaced, gasping and choking on salt water, I looked around desperately for other survivors. I could see pieces of wreckage, some life preservers, and what looked like part of a lifeboat that had broken apart during deployment. But I couldn't see any other crew members. The sea that had seemed manageable from the deck was different from water level. Swells that appeared gentle from aboard ship were now 6-foot walls of water that lifted me up and dropped me into valleys where I couldn't see anything but water. I managed to grab a life preserver that was floating nearby, but the horrible realization was beginning to set in. I was alone in the South China Sea with nothing but my inspection tools and the clothes on my back. The MV Prosperity had sunk in less than 4 minutes, taking 22 lives with her. I was the sole survivor, floating in hostile waters with no emergency beacon, no food, and no idea when or if rescue would come. My routine inspection had uncovered the structural flaw that killed 22 men, but it had come too late to save anyone except myself. And now I had to figure out how to survive long enough to tell the world what had gone wrong. The silence after the sinking was more terrifying than the chaos that preceded it. One moment I'd been surrounded by the sounds of a working ship, engines, voices, emergency alarms, and the next there was nothing but the rhythmic slap of waves against floating debris and the sound of my own labored breathing. I treaded water for several minutes, calling out names and hoping to hear responses from other survivors. Captain Shin, Ramirez, hello, anyone. My voice echoed across the empty water, but no one answered. The vastness of the ocean seemed to swallow my calls completely. The realization hit me gradually. I was alone. 22 men had died in those 4 minutes, and I was the only one left to tell their story. The weight of that responsibility was almost as heavy as the physical challenge of staying alive. The water temperature was about 82 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but I knew that even warm water would eventually sap my body heat and strength. In these conditions, I had maybe 18 to 24 hours before exhaustion would start affecting my ability to stay afloat. Human physiology in water follows predictable patterns. Even in warm water, the body loses heat approximately 25 times faster than in air of the same temperature. Combined with the energy expenditure required for treading water, I was looking at a finite survival window unless I could create a more efficient floating system. I began collecting whatever useful debris I could find floating nearby. My inspector's mindset kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, inventory available resources, develop a plan based on what was actually possible rather than what I wished I had. The debris field from the MV Prosperity was scattered but substantial. I could see pieces of wooden decking, plastic containers, sections of metal superstructure, and various items that had broken free during the sinking. Each piece represented a potential component in a survival system if I could figure out how to use it effectively. Floating nearby was a section of wooden decking about 4 feet by 2 feet. It wasn't large enough to support my full weight, but it could serve as a flotation aid and work platform. I also recovered a plastic water container that had broken free from the galley, though it was empty and had several cracks that would need to be sealed. Most importantly, my toolkit was still strapped to my belt. The waterproof case had protected my instruments from initial water damage, and I realized these precision tools might become the key to my survival in ways their designers never intended. My toolkit contained an ultrasonic thickness gauge, a set of precision scrapers and picks, a small engineering hammer, measuring calipers, a powerful LED flashlight designed for detailed inspection work, various small metal tools for precise measurements, and a folding knife that I used for cutting samples and opening containers. At first glance, none of these seemed particularly useful for ocean survival. But I'd learned during my years as an inspector that the right tool applied creatively could solve problems it was never designed for. Engineering principles are universal. They apply whether you're testing hull integrity or building survival equipment. The first challenge was creating a more stable floating platform. The wooden decking was helpful, but I needed something larger and more buoyant to have any real chance of long-term survival. The physics of flotation are straightforward. I needed to displace enough water to support my body weight while minimizing energy expenditure. Using one of my precision picks, I began working on the cracked water container. The plastic was thick and durable, designed for marine use and capable of holding pressure. If I could seal the cracks, I might be able to create an air-filled flotation chamber that would significantly improve my buoyancy. The work required patience and precision while treading water. Each crack had to be carefully aligned and sealed using whatever materials I could improvise. I used strips of fabric torn from my coveralls, twisted and compressed into the cracks, then sealed with pressure applied using my small hammer. The technique was similar to emergency patching procedures I'd learned for temporary hull repairs, but adapted for much smaller scale and different materials. The key was creating a seal that would hold under pressure while being flexible enough to accommodate the movement of the water. After 2 hours of careful work, I had converted the damaged container into a functional flotation device. It wasn't perfect, air leaked slowly from the improvised seals, but it provided enough buoyancy to support part of my upper body while I rested. By 2 p.m., the sun was becoming a serious problem. Without protection, my pale Scottish skin was burning rapidly in the tropical sun. The reflection off the water created a double exposure that was cooking me from above and below simultaneously. Sun exposure in marine environments is particularly dangerous because of the reflection factor. Water reflects approximately 10 to 15% of UV radiation back upward, effectively creating a double dose of exposure. Combined with the lack of any shade or protection, I was facing severe burns within hours. I used my precision scrapers to carefully remove sections of fabric from my coveralls, creating a makeshift head covering. The work had to be done carefully. I needed to preserve as much clothing as possible for protection and insulation, while creating enough fabric for immediate sun protection. My folding knife proved invaluable for this work, allowing me to make precise cuts that removed fabric without damaging the overall integrity of my clothing. Each cut had to be planned carefully to maximize the utility of both the removed fabric and the remaining garment. At 3:30 p.m., I encountered my first serious challenge: dehydration. I'd been in the water for over 4 hours, and my body was beginning to show signs of fluid loss. The salt spray, combined with the sun exposure, was accelerating dehydration beyond normal rates. My mouth was becoming dry, and I could feel the early symptoms of heat exhaustion beginning to develop. That's when I remembered something from my engineering training about solar distillation. The principles of heat transfer and phase change that applied to marine engineering systems could also be used for water purification. Using the cracked water container and some clear plastic debris I'd collected, I began constructing a primitive water purification system. The concept was simple in theory but complex in execution. Use solar heat to evaporate seawater, then condense the vapor into fresh water. The evaporation would leave behind the salt and other contaminants, producing clean drinking water from the ocean around me. I used my precision tools to create a small chamber inside the plastic container. Seawater would go in the bottom compartment, and solar heat would evaporate it. The vapor would condense on a clear plastic sheet positioned above, then drip down into a collection area that I fashioned from clean fabric. The system required precise positioning and careful sealing to work effectively. I used my calipers to measure exact distances and angles that would optimize heat collection and condensation efficiency. My picks allowed me to create mounting points and vapor channels that would direct the distilled water to the collection point. The physics involved were straightforward but required precise implementation. The evaporation rate depended on surface area, temperature differential, and air circulation. The condensation efficiency depended on the temperature difference between the vapor and the condensation surface. By 4:45 p.m., I had a functioning solar still. It wasn't producing much water, maybe a few ounces per hour, but it was producing fresh water that could keep me alive. More importantly, it proved that I could engineer solutions to survival challenges using technical knowledge and precision tools. As evening approached, I faced a new challenge: staying warm as the sun disappeared. Water temperature in the South China Sea drops significantly at night, and I needed to conserve body heat to survive until morning. Using more fabric from my coveralls and some floating debris, I created an insulation layer around my upper body. The key was trapping air in small pockets that would provide thermal protection while still allowing me to float and move when necessary. The insulation system used the same principles as marine thermal protection systems, creating dead air spaces that would slow heat transfer while maintaining flexibility and mobility. I used my measuring tools to ensure proper thickness and spacing of the insulation layers. At 6:15 p.m., just as the sun was setting, I saw something that gave me the first real hope since the sinking: the lights of a distant ship on the horizon. I grabbed my LED flashlight, the most powerful tool in my kit, and began signaling. The light was designed for close-up inspection work, but it was extremely bright and had a focused beam that could potentially be visible for miles under the right conditions. I flashed the international distress signal: 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes. SOS in Morse code, repeated continuously for 27 minutes as the ship crossed the horizon. The signaling technique required precise timing and consistent execution. Too fast, and the pattern would be unreadable. Too slow, and it might be dismissed as random equipment malfunction. I had to maintain the exact rhythm that would be recognizable as an intentional distress call. The vessel never changed course. Either they hadn't seen my signal, or they dismissed it as something else. But the sighting confirmed something important. I was in a shipping lane. Other vessels would pass through this area, and eventually one of them might spot me. As darkness fell completely, I settled into what would be the longest night of my life. The water was cooler but still manageable, and my improvised flotation system was holding together better than I'd expected. I used this time to work on improving my survival equipment. My precision tools allowed me to make small but important modifications to my water collection system and flotation devices. Each adjustment was based on lessons learned during the first day's operation. More importantly, I used the time to think through what had happened aboard the MV Prosperity. As the only witness to the sinking, I had a responsibility to understand exactly what had gone wrong and why 22 men had died. The hull failure had occurred exactly where my instruments had detected the worst corrosion. The vessel had been operating with compromised structural integrity, probably for months or even years. Previous inspections had either missed the problem or ignored it due to economic pressures. This was a systemic failure, not just a random accident. The deterioration I'd detected should have been caught much earlier if proper inspection protocols had been followed. The deaths of Captain Chen and his crew were preventable if maritime safety systems had worked as intended. As I floated alone in the darkness, I realized that my survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about making sure the truth about the MV Prosperity reached the authorities so that similar tragedies could be prevented. At 11:30 p.m., exhaustion was beginning to affect my coordination and judgment. I used my toolkit to create a simple alarm system, metal tools arranged to make noise if I started to drift off and lose control of my position. The ocean at night was a different world entirely. Sounds carried differently, temperatures dropped unpredictably, and the complete darkness created a psychological pressure that was almost unbearable. Every splash or unexpected sound could represent rescue or danger, and the uncertainty was emotionally draining. But my inspector's training had taught me to focus on facts and procedures rather than emotions. I had specific tasks to complete: maintain my flotation system, operate my water still, watch for rescue opportunities, and document everything I observed for eventual testimony. By dawn, I would need to be ready for whatever the second day might bring. My survival depended on maintaining the precision and methodical approach that had served me throughout my career as a marine engineer. Dawn of the second day brought new challenges I hadn't anticipated. My improvised flotation system had held through the night, but the constant motion of the waves was gradually loosening the connections I'd made with strips of fabric and pressure fittings. More critically, my solar still had produced only about 8 ounces of fresh water during its first day of operation, not nearly enough to prevent progressive dehydration. I needed to improve the system's efficiency or find alternative water sources before my condition deteriorated further. The human body requires approximately 2 liters of water per day under normal conditions, but the requirements increase significantly in hot, sunny environments with high salt exposure. I estimated I needed at least 1 liter per day to maintain basic function, which meant my current water production was insufficient by a factor of 3. At 6:30 a.m., I began dismantling and rebuilding my distillation apparatus using lessons learned from the first day's operation. The problem was heat loss and vapor escape. Too much energy was being wasted instead of being channeled into water production. Using my precision calipers, I measured exact angles and distances for repositioning the condensation surfaces. My engineering background told me that small changes in geometry could dramatically improve efficiency in thermal systems. The key was optimizing the surface area available for condensation while minimizing heat loss to the environment. I used my smallest picks to create tiny drainage channels that would direct condensed water toward the collection point rather than allowing it to drip back into the evaporation chamber. Each channel had to be precisely positioned to work with gravity and the motion of the waves. The engineering principles involved were the same ones I used for analyzing heat transfer systems aboard ships, but adapted for much smaller scale and improvised materials. Heat transfer efficiency depends on surface area, temperature differential, and flow characteristics, all of which could be optimized through careful design. After 3 hours of meticulous work, I had a solar still that was producing nearly double the water output. Still not enough for complete hydration, but sufficient to prevent immediate medical crisis. At 10:45 a.m., I spotted something that made my heart race. A fishing vessel about 2 miles away, moving slowly in what appeared to be a search pattern. I immediately began signaling with my LED flashlight, but the daylight made the beam much less visible than it had been at night. I needed a different approach for daytime signaling that would be effective against the bright background of sky and water. Using my precision scrapers, I began working on a piece of aluminum debris I'd collected from the ship's superstructure. The metal was thin but highly reflective, and with careful manipulation, I could create a signal mirror that would be visible for miles in bright sunlight. The work required extreme precision. I had to flatten the aluminum without creating holes, then polish it to create a mirror-quality surface using the smooth sides of my inspection tools. The aluminum was work-hardened and resistant to shaping, but my precision tools allowed me to work gradually without causing fractures. My small hammer proved invaluable for this work, allowing me to apply controlled force that shaped the metal without damaging it. The technique was similar to sheet metal work I'd observed in shipyards, but adapted for much thinner material and limited tools. After 45 minutes of careful work, I had a signal mirror about 6 inches square. Using the sun's position and the fishing vessel's location, I calculated the proper angle and began reflecting sunlight toward the boat. The physics of mirror signaling are straightforward but require precise execution. The angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection, so positioning the mirror requires calculating the geometric relationship between the sun, the mirror, and the target. My engineering training provided the mathematical background to optimize the signal strength. The reflected sunlight created a bright flash that should have been visible for several miles under clear atmospheric conditions. I maintained the signal for over an hour, adjusting the angle as both the sun and the vessel moved across my field of view. The fishing boat never changed course. Either the crew hadn't seen my signal, or they dismissed it as random reflection off floating debris. But the experience taught me something important. I needed multiple signaling methods to maximize my chances of attracting attention. Using materials from my toolkit and debris from the wreck, I began constructing additional survival aids. My precision tools allowed me to work with small components and create devices that would have been impossible to build with crude improvisation. I used my thickness gauge to test the integrity of various pieces of debris, identifying the strongest materials for construction projects. The gauge could detect internal flaws and stress concentrations that weren't visible on the surface, allowing me to select materials that would hold up under the stress of ocean conditions. My picks proved invaluable for creating precise connection points that would hold under stress. Instead of relying on crude lashing or friction fits, I could create mechanical connections that distributed loads properly and wouldn't fail under dynamic loading. By noon, I had expanded my survival platform to include a larger flotation area, an improved water collection system, and multiple signaling devices including the mirror, my flashlight, and a primitive flag made from bright fabric. The second day also brought my first serious medical challenge. Around 1:30 p.m., I noticed a small cut on my right hand that had become infected. The wound was minor, probably from handling sharp debris during the night, but in the warm, contaminated water, infection could spread rapidly and become life-threatening. Marine environments are particularly dangerous for wound infection because of the high bacterial content in seawater. Even minor cuts can develop serious infections within hours if not properly treated, and I had no access to antiseptics or antibiotics. I used my smallest precision pick to carefully clean the wound, removing dead tissue and debris. The tools were designed for delicate work, and they allowed me to perform surgery-level cleaning without causing additional trauma to the surrounding healthy tissue. For antiseptic, I used the only option available: concentrated salt water created by evaporating seawater to increase the salt concentration. It was painful but effective, and the precise application possible with my tools minimized tissue damage while maximizing antiseptic effect. I created a bandage using clean fabric and positioned it to protect the wound while still allowing access for regular cleaning. The precision tools made it possible to secure the bandage without restricting circulation or mobility, critical factors for maintaining hand function. At 3:15 p.m., I encountered something that would become crucial to my long-term survival: a school of small fish that had gathered around my floating platform. Fish are naturally attracted to floating objects because they provide shelter and attract smaller organisms that serve as food. My expanding debris field was becoming an artificial reef that could provide me with protein if I could find a way to catch the fish. The challenge was creating fishing equipment from materials never intended for that purpose. I needed hooks, line, and bait that would be effective for small tropical fish species. Using my wire picks and some electrical wire from the ship's debris, I began constructing a fishing apparatus. The work required extreme precision. Fishing hooks need to be shaped exactly right to be effective, and I was working with materials that had completely different properties from traditional fishing gear. My precision tools allowed me to bend and shape the wire into functional hooks, create proper barbs to prevent fish from escaping, and construct joints that would hold under the stress of fighting fish. The geometry of a fishing hook is critical. The point angle, barb position, and overall proportions all affect success rates. For fishing line, I used thin electrical wire stripped from damaged cables. It wasn't ideal, but it was strong enough for small fish and could be connected to my hooks using techniques I'd developed for making precise electrical connections during equipment installations. For bait, I used small pieces of bright fabric that moved in the water like injured organisms. The key was creating the right action and appearance to trigger the fish's feeding response. Different fish species respond to different types of movement and color patterns. After 2 hours of patient fishing, I caught my first meal, a small fish about 4 inches long. It wasn't much, but it was protein that my body desperately needed to maintain strength and immune function. More importantly, the success proved that I could obtain food from the ocean using improvised tools. This changed my survival outlook from hours or days to potentially much longer, assuming I could maintain and improve my fishing capability. The fish provided essential nutrients that weren't available from water alone. Protein for muscle maintenance, fats for energy storage, and various vitamins and minerals that would help prevent deficiency diseases during extended survival. As the second evening approached, I had established a sustainable pattern: water production during daylight hours, fishing in the afternoon when fish were most active, and equipment maintenance during cooler evening temperatures. My precision tools had become the foundation of everything I was doing. The exact measurements, careful adjustments, and detailed work possible with proper instruments made the difference between crude improvisation and effective survival engineering. At sunset, I saw another ship on the horizon. This time, I was ready with multiple signaling methods: my mirror for reflecting the last sunlight, my LED flashlight for direct signaling, and my improvised flag for visual identification. I coordinated all 3 signals simultaneously, creating the brightest and most obvious distress display I could manage. The combination of different signal types increased the probability that at least one would be noticed by the vessel's watch. For 38 minutes, I maintained continuous signaling as the vessel crossed my field of view. The coordination required precise timing and careful energy management. I couldn't afford to exhaust myself with ineffective signaling. Once again, there was no response. But I wasn't discouraged. Each sighting confirmed that I was in an active shipping area, and eventually, someone would notice my signals if I could maintain them long enough. As darkness fell on my second night, I reflected on what I'd learned. Survival wasn't about having the perfect equipment. It was about using whatever tools you had with maximum precision and efficiency. My inspector's toolkit, designed for measuring and analyzing ship structures, had become the foundation of a survival system that was keeping me alive against overwhelming odds. But I also knew that time was running out. Despite my water production and food gathering, I was gradually weakening. The physical demands of maintaining my survival system, combined with limited nutrition and the stress of isolation, were taking their toll. I needed rescue within the next few days, or even the best improvised survival system wouldn't be enough to keep me alive. The third day would be critical. The third morning began with a crisis that almost ended everything I'd built. During the night, a larger wave had damaged my solar still, flooding the fresh water reservoir and destroying 6 hours of careful production. Worse, the impact had also damaged my main flotation platform, and I was taking on water faster than I could bail it out with improvised tools. The structural connections I'd created were failing under the repeated stress of wave action, and my carefully engineered survival system was coming apart. At 6:45 a.m., with my survival system failing around me, I had to make rapid decisions about what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt from scratch. This was exactly the kind of emergency analysis I'd been trained to perform on damaged vessels, but now my own life depended on getting it right. I used my ultrasonic thickness gauge to rapidly assess the damage to various components. The readings told me which pieces of my platform had sufficient structural integrity to continue supporting my weight and which were compromised beyond repair. The gauge revealed stress concentrations in the aluminum sheeting that weren't visible to casual inspection. Some connections that appeared solid were actually on the verge of failure, while other joints that looked damaged were still structurally sound. Working with methodical precision despite the urgency of the situation, I began dismantling the damaged sections and rebuilding using lessons learned from 2 days of trial and error. Every decision had to be made quickly but correctly. There was no room for mistakes that would waste precious materials or energy. My precision picks allowed me to work quickly without damaging salvageable components. Every piece of debris, every strip of fabric, every small component had to be used efficiently because I had no replacements available. The rebuilding process required applying engineering principles under extreme stress. Load distribution, structural redundancy, failure mode analysis, all the concepts I used for ship inspection were now being applied to my own survival platform. By 9:30 a.m., I had a rebuilt platform that was actually more stable than the original. The forced reconstruction had allowed me to incorporate improvements I'd been planning but hadn't had the opportunity to implement. The new solar still was more efficient, with better vapor capture and improved condensation surfaces. My flotation system was more distributed, making it less vulnerable to single-point failures. The signaling equipment was better integrated and more easily deployable. But the reconstruction had cost me precious energy and time, and I could feel my overall condition deteriorating. My hands were developing multiple cuts and infections from handling debris, and my skin was severely burned despite my improvised protection. The physical demands of precision work while floating in the ocean were enormous. Every task required maintaining balance and position while performing delicate operations with tools that weren't designed for marine environments. At 11:20 a.m., I made a decision that would prove crucial. I began using my precision tools to create a more sophisticated fishing system. The small fish I'd been catching weren't providing enough nutrition to offset the energy I was expending. I needed to catch larger fish, which meant developing better hooks, stronger line, and more effective bait presentation. Using my calipers to measure exact proportions, I created hooks from electrical wire that were properly sized for different species of fish. My picks allowed me to shape barbs and bends with professional precision, creating hooks that would hold fish securely without causing unnecessary injury. I constructed a multi-hook system that would allow me to fish at different depths simultaneously, increasing my chances of success. The engineering principles I'd learned for ship construction applied directly to fishing equipment design, load distribution, material selection, and failure prevention. The improved system required more sophisticated bait presentation. I used my knowledge of marine biology to create lures that mimicked the movement and appearance of natural prey species. Different fish respond to different stimulus patterns, and my engineering background helped me understand the mechanical principles involved. The results were immediate and dramatic. By 1 p.m., I had caught 3 fish, including one nearly 8 inches long that provided significant protein and fat. More importantly, I was now catching fish faster than I could consume them, which opened up possibilities for food preservation. But success in fishing created a new problem: food preservation. In the tropical heat, raw fish would spoil rapidly unless I could find a way to process and store it safely. I used my smallest precision tools to create thin strips of fish meat that would dry more quickly in the sun and wind. The cuts had to be exact: too thick and the meat wouldn't dry properly, too thin and it would fall apart or be blown away. The food preservation techniques I implemented were based on traditional methods but refined using modern understanding of heat transfer and moisture control. I created a drying rack using wire debris and positioned it to maximize air circulation while protecting the meat from salt spray contamination. My engineering knowledge of heat transfer and airflow was directly applicable to food preservation. The key was creating conditions that would remove moisture quickly while preventing bacterial growth and contamination. At 3:45 p.m., I spotted something that made my pulse quicken. A helicopter in the distance, flying low over the water in what appeared to be a systematic search pattern. This was different from the ships I'd been seeing. Helicopters flew search patterns for specific purposes, either looking for survivors or investigating reported debris. Either way, it represented my best chance yet for rescue. The helicopter was following a grid pattern, methodically covering sections of ocean in overlapping sweeps. This was exactly the kind of organized search activity that gave me hope. They weren't just flying randomly, they had a plan and the resources to execute it. I immediately deployed all my signaling methods simultaneously. The signal mirror caught the afternoon sun and threw brilliant flashes toward the aircraft. My LED flashlight provided a different spectrum of light that might be more visible against certain backgrounds. My improvised flag created motion and color contrast. But most importantly, I used my precision tools to create a new type of signal, precisely timed light flashes that would be obviously artificial and intentional rather than random reflection. Using my watch and my knowledge of international signaling protocols, I created a complex pattern of flashes that spelled out SOS and Survivor in both Morse code and international aviation signals. The timing had to be exact. Too fast and the pattern would be unreadable, too slow and it might be dismissed as equipment malfunction. I used my engineering precision to maintain perfect rhythm and timing despite the physical stress and excitement. The helicopter continued its search pattern for 47 minutes, coming within what I estimated was half a mile of my position. I maintained continuous, precisely coordinated signaling the entire time, adjusting my techniques based on the aircraft's position and the changing light conditions. When the aircraft finally disappeared over the horizon without changing course, I felt the first real despair since the sinking. If a search helicopter at that distance couldn't spot my signals, what chance did I have with more distant vessels? But I forced myself to think like an engineer rather than a victim. The helicopter's presence meant someone was actively searching this area. They were looking for survivors or evidence of the sinking, which meant my location was approximately correct for where rescue efforts would be concentrated. The fact that they were conducting systematic searches suggested that the MV Prosperity had been reported missing and that search and rescue operations were underway. This was enormously encouraging, even though this particular aircraft hadn't spotted me. I needed to improve my signaling capability to ensure that the next aircraft or vessel would definitely see me. The problem wasn't that my signals were invisible, it was that they weren't distinctive enough to catch attention in a marine environment full of reflections and false signals. Using debris from my platform and the most precise work I'd done yet, I began constructing a larger, more sophisticated signal mirror. The new design would use multiple reflecting surfaces to create a broader, more intense signal beam. The work required hours of careful measurement and positioning. Each reflecting surface had to be angled exactly right to contribute to the overall signal rather than working against it. The physics involved were complex. Multiple reflections could either reinforce each other or cancel each other out depending on the precise angles involved. I used my calipers to measure angles to the nearest degree, and my picks to create mounting points that would hold the surfaces in precise alignment despite wave motion and wind. The mechanical precision required was similar to what I used for optical equipment calibration during ship inspections. The multi-surface mirror system was based on the same principles used in lighthouse reflectors and searchlight assemblies. By carefully controlling the geometry of multiple reflecting surfaces, I could create a focused beam that was much more intense than a simple flat mirror. By sunset, I had a signaling system that was dramatically more effective than anything I'd built before. The multi-surface mirror could throw a signal beam visible for miles in any direction, and the precisely timed flashing pattern would be unmistakably artificial. As the third night approached, I realized that my situation had fundamentally changed. I was no longer just surviving, I was actively engineering my own rescue using precision tools and technical knowledge. My water production was sufficient to prevent dehydration. My fishing system was providing adequate nutrition. My flotation platform was stable and robust. Most importantly, my signaling capability was now sophisticated enough to attract attention from rescue assets operating in the area. At 9:15 p.m., I saw lights on the horizon that appeared to be moving in a search pattern. I immediately began signaling with my new system, creating precise light patterns that would be impossible to miss or dismiss as natural phenomena. For 2 hours, I maintained continuous signaling toward the distant lights. The coordination required precise timing and energy management, but I was confident that my signals were now visible and recognizable as distress calls. When the lights finally disappeared, I had no way of knowing if they'd seen me, but I was confident that my signals had been visible. The engineering precision I'd applied to the signaling system gave me confidence that any reasonably alert watch would notice the obviously artificial light patterns. As I settled in for what I hoped would be my last night alone on the ocean, I reflected on what the experience had taught me about the relationship between precision and survival. Every measurement, every careful adjustment, every precisely positioned component had contributed to keeping me alive. The difference between crude improvisation and technical precision had been the difference between hopeless struggling and effective survival engineering. My inspector's tools, designed for detecting problems in ship construction, had become the instruments of my own preservation. The same attention to detail that had identified the structural flaws in the MV Prosperity was now being used to create the systems that would bring me home alive. Tomorrow would bring either rescue or the need to continue refining my survival system. Either way, I was ready. The precision that had defined my career as a marine inspector was now defining my survival as a castaway. The fourth morning began with something I'd almost stopped believing I would see: a Coast Guard cutter on the horizon, moving in a systematic search pattern that would bring it within visual range of my position. At 7:23 a.m., the vessel was approximately 3 miles away and closing. This was my moment. Everything I'd built, every precise modification I'd made to my signaling system, every carefully calculated improvement would now be tested under the ultimate conditions. I activated my multi-surface signal mirror and began the most important signaling sequence of my life. The morning sun provided perfect conditions for reflection, and my precisely angled surfaces threw an intense beam that should have been visible for miles under the clear atmospheric conditions. But I didn't rely on just one signaling method. I coordinated my mirror with my LED flashlight, creating a dual-spectrum signal that would be visible under any atmospheric conditions. My improvised flag provided motion and color contrast that would catch the eye even if the light signals were missed. Most importantly, I used the precise timing protocols I developed to create unmistakably artificial signal patterns. Instead of random flashing that might be dismissed as debris reflection, I transmitted carefully structured sequences that could only be created by intelligent intention. The signaling required enormous physical effort and mental concentration. I had to maintain perfect timing while coordinating multiple devices, all while floating on an unstable platform in moving water. But my engineering training had taught me to work with precision under difficult conditions. At 7:41 a.m., the impossible happened. The Coast Guard cutter changed course and began heading directly toward my position. They had seen me. After 4 days of isolation, the sight of that white hull growing larger was almost overwhelming. But I forced myself to maintain my signaling routine until the vessel was close enough that visual contact was certain. The professional satisfaction of seeing my engineering solution work perfectly was almost as powerful as the relief of impending rescue. The precision timing, careful positioning, and systematic approach had succeeded exactly as my calculations had predicted. The rescue boat that was launched from the cutter reached me at 8:07 a.m. The crew members who pulled me from the water were amazed at the sophistication of my survival system. "Sir, how did you manage to build all this?" the rescue swimmer asked, looking at my flotation platform, water collection system, signaling equipment, and food preservation setup. I held up my inspector's toolkit. "Precision instruments," I said, "and the knowledge of how to use them properly." The toolkit that had saved my life was still functioning perfectly despite 4 days of marine exposure. The waterproof case had protected the delicate instruments, and their precision had made the difference between effective survival engineering and crude improvisation. The Coast Guard medics immediately began treating my injuries: severe sunburn, multiple cuts and infections, dehydration despite my water production efforts, and the beginning stages of heat exhaustion. But I was alive and coherent. which they said was remarkable after 4 days alone in open ocean. The medical assessment revealed just how close I'd come to serious medical crisis. My water production had been sufficient to prevent immediate dehydration, but I was showing early signs of electrolyte imbalance and kidney stress. Another day or two would have pushed me past the point where my improvised systems could sustain life. As we headed back toward Hong Kong, I provided a complete briefing on the MV Prosperity sinking. The Coast Guard commander was particularly interested in my technical analysis of the hull failure and the circumstances that had led to the disaster. "You're saying the vessel sank due to structural deterioration that should have been caught in previous inspections?" he asked, taking detailed notes of my testimony. "The hull plating was compromised beyond acceptable limits," I explained, showing him the photographs and measurements I'd taken during my inspection. My instruments detected the problem during my inspection, but we didn't have time to return to port before the failure occurred. "What about the crew? You were the only survivor." That was the hardest part of my testimony. 22 men had died because a ship's structure had been allowed to deteriorate beyond safe limits. My technical knowledge had identified the problem, but not in time to save anyone except myself. The Coast Guard investigation that followed was extensive and revealing. My detailed measurements and photographs, taken during the inspection hours before the sinking, provided crucial evidence about the vessel's condition at the time of failure. The MV Prosperity had been operating with compromised hull integrity for months, possibly years. Previous inspections had either missed the corrosion or had been falsified to allow the vessel to continue operating despite safety concerns. My documentation proved that the structural deterioration was extensive and should have been detected during routine inspections. The failure to identify these problems represented a systemic breakdown in maritime safety oversight. My survival story became part of a larger investigation into maritime safety enforcement and the adequacy of ship inspection protocols. The precision documentation I'd maintained, even while fighting for my life, helped identify systemic problems that went far beyond a single vessel. The investigation revealed that Chen Maritime Holdings had a history of operating vessels with deferred maintenance and inadequate safety inspections. Economic pressures had led to corners being cut on critical safety systems, with predictable but tragic results. 3 months later, I returned to work as a hull inspector, but with new appreciation for the life and death importance of precision in maritime safety. My experience had proven that attention to detail and proper use of technical instruments could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The tools that saved my life are now displayed in my office, mounted next to a photograph of the MV Prosperity taken hours before she sank. Every day when I see them, I'm reminded that precision isn't just about doing a job correctly. Sometimes it's about staying alive long enough to tell the truth about what went wrong. My inspector's toolkit, designed for measuring structural integrity in ships, had become the foundation of my own survival system. The same attention to detail that detected the hull failure that killed 22 men had kept me alive long enough to ensure their story would be told. The Coast Guard rescue crew said they'd never seen such a sophisticated survival setup created with such basic tools. But I knew the truth. Survival hadn't depended on having sophisticated tools. It had depended on using simple tools with maximum precision and technical knowledge. The engineering principles that governed ship construction also governed survival equipment design. Load distribution, structural redundancy, efficiency optimization, failure mode analysis, all the concepts I used daily as an inspector had been directly applicable to staying alive in the ocean. 6 months after the rescue, new regulations were implemented requiring more frequent and more thorough hull inspections on cargo vessels operating in Southeast Asian waters. My survival and testimony had helped prevent similar tragedies from claiming other crews. Captain Chen Wei and his 21 crew members never had a chance to tell their story. But my survival ensured that their deaths weren't meaningless, that the structural failures that killed them would be identified and prevented in other vessels. The ocean had taken 22 lives in 4 minutes, but it had also provided everything I needed to survive and bear witness. My grandfather, a shipbuilder in Glasgow, had always told me that ships were only as safe as the precision of their construction and maintenance. In the end, that same precision, applied to survival instead of construction, had kept me alive long enough to honor the memory of the men who died aboard the MV Prosperity. Epilogue: The Inspector's Legacy. 2 years after the MV Prosperity sinking, the maritime industry had implemented sweeping changes in ship inspection protocols. My survival testimony and technical documentation had become the foundation for new safety standards that would protect countless crew members in the future. The investigation revealed systemic problems in maritime safety oversight that extended far beyond a single vessel or shipping company. Economic pressures, inadequate inspection protocols, and corruption in the certification process had created conditions where vessels like the MV Prosperity could operate with compromised safety systems. My detailed documentation of the hull deterioration, combined with my survival testimony, provided the technical evidence needed to prosecute maritime safety violations and implement new regulations. The precision measurements I'd taken hours before the sinking became crucial evidence in both criminal and civil proceedings. The precision instruments that saved my life were eventually donated to the International Maritime Organization as examples of how proper tools and technical knowledge could mean the difference between life and death in emergency situations. The toolkit is now part of a traveling safety exhibition that visits maritime academies and shipping companies worldwide. Students and professionals can see firsthand how engineering precision, applied under extreme conditions, can create effective solutions to seemingly impossible problems. But the most important legacy of my survival wasn't the equipment or the technical innovations. It was the proof that attention to detail and methodical thinking could overcome almost impossible odds. The same qualities that made me an effective ship inspector, systematic analysis, precise measurement, careful documentation, and methodical problem-solving, had been directly applicable to survival engineering. The skills that detected structural flaws in vessels had been used to construct the systems that kept me alive. I still work as a hull inspector, but now my reports carry additional weight. Ship owners and operators know that my recommendations are based not just on technical standards, but on first-hand knowledge of what happens when those standards fail. Every inspection I perform is informed by the memory of 22 men who died because structural problems were ignored or overlooked. The precision that kept me alive for 4 days continues to guide my work in preventing similar tragedies. The MV Prosperity was never recovered from the bottom of the South China Sea, but her legacy lives on in every inspection I perform and every safety protocol that was strengthened because of what I witnessed during her final voyage. Captain Qin Wei's family invited me to his memorial service in Shanghai. His widow, Mrs. Qin, thanked me for ensuring that her husband's death had meaning, that the investigation sparked by my survival had led to changes that would prevent other families from experiencing their loss. He would be proud, she told me, that his final voyage helped make the seas safer for other sailors. The 21 crew members are remembered on a memorial plaque at the Hong Kong Marine Department. Their names are listed alongside the technical specifications of the hull failure that killed them, a reminder that behind every engineering failure are real people with families, dreams, and futures that were cut short. I visit that memorial every year on September 8th, the anniversary of the sinking. I bring my toolkit, the same instruments that saved my life, and I remember each man who didn't make it home that day. The precision that detected the structural flaws in the MV Prosperity had come too late to save her crew. But the same precision, applied to survival instead of inspection, had ensured their story would be told and their deaths would have meaning. In my office, next to the mounted toolkit, hangs a certificate from the International Maritime Organization recognizing my contributions to maritime safety. But the real recognition comes every time a hull inspector catches a structural problem before it becomes a catastrophe, every time a crew goes home safely because someone paid attention to the details that matter. The ocean that nearly claimed my life continues to be my workplace. I inspect vessels in the same waters where the MV Prosperity sank, using the same type of instruments that both identified her fatal flaw and kept me alive long enough to report it. Every measurement I take, every test I perform, every report I write is informed by the knowledge that precision isn't just about technical standards. It's about the difference between life and death for the men and women who depend on these vessels for their livelihood. My grandfather would have understood. He spent his life building ships in the Glasgow yards, where attention to detail meant the difference between vessels that brought sailors home and vessels that became their graves. The tools he inspired me to master, the precision he taught me to value, and the methodical thinking he instilled in my approach to engineering, all of it came together in 4 days on the South China Sea to prove that sometimes the smallest details make the biggest difference. I was just a hull inspector that morning, conducting a routine safety check on a cargo vessel. By sunset, I was the sole survivor of a maritime disaster, floating alone with nothing but my knowledge and my tools. But those tools, used with precision and purpose, had been enough to keep me alive long enough to ensure that 22 men didn't die for nothing. Sometimes that's all you can do. Sometimes that's everything.